All right. Old Testament. Weird stuff. It's hard to keep up. But the thing you can pull out right away, we've been complaining about taxes since, what was this, 1400 BC, right there. It's like, oh, you want a king? Well, there's this thing that's going to happen. All right, so we're in Samuel. And in the Old Testament, narrative is really, really important. You got to follow this storyline. Never pull a verse out of the Old Testament and just slap it on a t-shirt, ever. I mean, don't ever do that in the New Testament either, but especially in the Old Testament. Because the Old Testament is telling a story. So if you just take a verse out and be like, oh, this is a pretty verse, this is my verse, this is the thing, it is probably going to be out of its context, most likely. And so what we can't do with the Old Testament is forget that it's telling a really long story. Now, last week we started in Samuel and we're like, all right, we got to know where they've come to up until this moment. We got the Exodus moment, we've got coming out of Egypt and Moses and Joshua and getting a land, and then there's 1,000 years of Judges where they're up and down and things are not so great. And then all of a sudden, Samuel is born, and he is kind of like the last of the period of the Judges in the book of Judges. If you're ever in a bad place mentally, never ever read the book of Judges. I'm just going to warn you right off the bat. If you're ever in a sad place, go to Philippians, man. You go there. If you're sad, don't ever read Judges. It's the most depressing book in the Bible. Just disclaimer. So, you heard me mention Judges, you're like, I wonder what that's about. It's probably like the saddest book of the whole Old Testament. So that's just a fair warning. Samuel comes in right after these periods. They don't have a king. They just have these leaders that rise up called judges. And they just kind of like provide wisdom and guide them. They're tribal. They're like in these small groups. They're divided up into 12 tribes. And they kind of have like this one judge will kind of go around like a circuit rider preacher back in the day of the Methodists. And he would just kind of show up and like, all right, what are your problems? Let me see if I can work them out for you. And then they work them out and move on to the next one. And that's what Samuel rose up into. Now, we looked at the life of Samuel, and last week we covered chapters 1 through 7 in the narrative form. We didn't go through every single verse, but we looked at what was going on. There's a woman named Hannah and her husband Elkanah. They can't have kids. And in the Old Testament, that is like the worst news that you could have. It's not like today where you have a choice and you have, when you get old, there's not Social Security for you. Your kids are your retirement program. If you don't have kids, when you can't work for yourself in that point, you're going to be pretty poverty stricken. So this is bad news. And they also saw kids as a sign of God's blessing. Even though many people in the Old Testament who couldn't have kids were the ones who were leading things along the way. But still, that was a big, huge cultural thing for them. So she can't have kids, and she's not feeling good about that. And her husband's like, cheer up. Aren't I as good as 10 kids to you? Guys, again, don't say that. That was not good. Because the answer was no. She didn't be like, you're right, honey, thanks. That's like trying to say, why don't you just calm down? Yeah, that doesn't work. Nowhere in the history of the entire human race has someone calmed down by someone just coming up to them saying, you should calm down. It's it's the dumbest thing you can say in that moment. Because it's oh, I forgot. Yeah, I should just turn off the emotions and a switch. There we go. All better. Thanks for the reminder. Doesn't work that way. So Hannah prays in the tabernacle, and God hears her prayer through the priest Eli, who's in charge of stuff. And he's like, yes, God will grant you your prayer. So she has a child, and her promise to God was, if you give me a child, I'll give him back to you. So this is kind of child dedication comes from this whole concept. I'll give him back to you. But Eli adopted her son when he was only 3 years old. So he's living in the church building, basically. He's got a little bed in the corner of the sanctuary, and that's where he sleeps. When he was 12 years old, he heard the voice of God speaking to him. And so he thinks it's his Eli. So he keeps going to Eli. He's like, why do you keep calling me? He's like, oh, I'm not calling you. After 3 times, Eli said, oh, I bet that's God. I bet God's talking to you. So if you hear the voice again, just say, speak, Lord, here I am. And so at 12 years old, this little boy hears the voice of God. And he's like, all right, I remember what Eli said. Speak, Lord, I'm here. So he says that. And what does God say to this 12-year-old boy? This is a weird thing about the Old Testament. Could you go tell Eli that I'm about to kill his whole family? It's like, there's Old Testament for you right there. And so this 12-year-old boy has the task of going to Eli and saying, well, your sons are wicked and you're not doing anything about it. And they are not honoring the justice of God. God's going to fulfill the promise to like wipe out your family line, which is another Old Testament way of putting judgment on a family structure, is to kind of cut off the family line and you don't go forward into time anymore. That's a big thing with people who have genealogies. So, weird thing that the Old Testament, I know it sounds weird to us 3,400 years later. It's supposed to sound weird to us because we don't live then. But that's what Samuel says, and then it comes to pass that they go to war, the Israelites go to war with this group called the Philistines, and the Philistines won, and they stole their prized possession that signifies the presence and blessing of God, the Ark of the Covenant. If you've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark with Indiana Jones, you know what that looks like. And so they steal that. So the messenger comes back and tells Eli, he's like, hey, how'd the war go? He's like, well, we lost. Your sons died in battle, and the Ark of the Covenant was stolen. And then Eli has a heart attack, falls over, and dies, breaks his neck. So it's like, all right, there's Old Testament for you. Old Testament is some weird stuff where a 12-year-old had to give that message. But that's it. And then Samuel just says, the thing we're supposed to pull out of that is Samuel is someone who's different than Eli and his sons. So Samuel becomes the person who's in charge, because Eli died, and now it's Samuel's job to like lead the people. It's like, all right, I guess the buck falls to me, and I'll do this. And it says, it wraps up that series. It says, Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. He went on a circuit year by year to Bethel, Gilgal, Mizpah, and he judged Israel in all these places. Then he would come back to Ramah, for his home was there, and he administered justice there to Israel and built there an altar to the Lord. So that kind of sums up his whole life, right there, 1 through 7. And then we get to chapter 8, and we are not going to do more than the verses that were spoken in chapter 8, because this is probably the turning point in the entire history of the people of God in the Old Testament. This is it. Like, this is the point where everything changes. And it changes with the demand that says, we want a king. So that's the people go up to him and they say, you know what? Samuel, you're old and your sons aren't really cool. You know, they're not really outstanding folks in the whole thing. What we don't want to do this judge thing anymore where you're circuit riding and judging. We just want somebody to oversee it all. We want a king. And we want a king so that we will be like the other nations. That's a key phrase in the Old Testament. We want to be just like them. Very key phrase there. Now, something that you have to keep in mind, the Old Testament's a story. And the story that it starts telling from the beginning is this narrative of empire versus Eden. Now, if you remember in Genesis 1, there is a story of the Garden of Eden. You know, Adam and Eve are created, and then they eat the fruit, and they fall, but they had 2 kids, and then Cain and Abel. And Cain murdered Abel, his brother, because he was jealous. And then God comes in, he's like, all right, Cain, here's the deal. You killed your brother, so that's not cool. I'm banishing you from the garden. Adam and Eve are banished from the garden, and now you're banished from this place. You have to go. And the first thing that Cain does is he builds a city. It's the first time in the Old Testament that that's mentioned. When something's mentioned for the first time, oftentimes you got to pay attention to why. So we're starting this thing like, okay, we had a garden, we had a wilderness, we had like this place, and now we're building cities, empires, structures, and things. And the whole Old Testament story is put on track right in this moment of there is the empire versus Eden. And you can see it in Genesis chapter 10, where Abraham is called out of the capital city of Mesopotamia, Ur. He's like, I got a plan for you. It can't happen in here. You're going to have to leave this land and go to a place I have yet to show you. And so we have that theme there. And then we have it in Egypt with Moses. The big super empire structure of the day is Moses. And he's called out. He goes out in the desert for 40 years. Then we see it with Israel. Israel is called out as slaves from Egypt. And they wander around the wilderness for 40 years. And we see it over and over and over and over again. We see it in the bad guys are always the ones who have the empire in the Bible. Every single time. We have the Babylonians, we have the Persians, we have the Assyrians. And then in the New Testament, we have the Romans. And so there's this tension in the Old Testament that bleeds into the New Testament of there is like the empire structures that we build, and then there is like where God is found. And there is supposed to be this tension that we notice here. And this Old Testament scholar, Richard Middleton, said this: the Old Testament presents a reoccurring theme of human rebellion against God's ideal, epitomized in the construction of empires. From Cain's founding of the city of Nod to the imperial aspirations of Babylon, these narratives contrast with the Edenic vision of a society rooted in divine justice and peace. So we have here this guy, Old Testament scholar, saying this is the theme of the Bible. God wants to meet us in these wilderness places, and we're like, I'd rather build an empire. I'd rather build this great thing. I'd rather have this huge king. And so God's always calling people out of the empire structures in the Bible to speak to them. So we have like people like Abraham, we have people like Jacob, we have people like Moses, we have David when he's anointed king. God won't do it in the city. It happens in his shepherd field while he's like watching over sheep. So he's anointed king like outside of the official structure. We have Elijah, we have Elisha, we have Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, even the prophet Jonah. All of these people, when God wants to speak to them, pulls them away from these like empire structures and says, I have a plan for you. I have a mission for you. I have a message for you that you have to then go back to the people on the inside and tell them something. And my homeboy Thomas Merton said this: in the silence and solitude of the wilderness, one can hear the divine call away from the corrupting influences of empire, echoing the journeys of Abraham, Moses, and the prophets. So this is a major theme, probably the theme of the Old Testament. The major theme of the Old Testament that bleeds into the New is that this whole process of building an empire is apart from what God envisions and what God has planned for us. And this point here in the Old Testament narrative is the turning point of the whole Old Testament narrative, where they've kind of been like struggling back and forth with how to be like a people without an organized structure over them. They're just kind of like tribes and stuff. And they're like, all right, we're done with this tribe thing. We want a king so that we can be like other nations. This is the moment where everything changes in the story of the Old Testament, and everything goes downhill. If you've ever read the book of 1st or 2nd Kings, it's all downhill. That's another crazy story there. But this is the turning point. Walter Brueggemann, Old Testament scholar, he calls the moment right here that we're reading today the paganization of the people of God. It's like, whoa, this is some like really strong language. From Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann, because they're choosing power over justice in this moment, and that is an important line in the Old Testament we got to remember. It's not just anything organized is bad. Humans are going to organize. We got to organize, but the thing here is they're choosing power over justice, and that is a big thing to God, especially in the Old Testament, because over and over and over again, God is calling us to live in a way that brings justice to the earth. And this guy here, John Goldingay, says the request for a king in 1 Samuel 8 marks a pivotal moment in Israel's history. It symbolizes the transition from a theocratic judgeship to a centralized monarchy, which brought both consolidation and complications to Israel's identity and faithfulness. The demand for a king in this passage was the rejection of God. That's what it comes down to. This moment here where they're like, we want a king. We do not want all this stuff that we've been doing. That is the moment where God comes to Samuel and says, they haven't rejected you. They've rejected me. So he hears this, and he has like this emotion rise up in him. It's kind of like, oh, guys, you broke it. Like, we had something good going on here, and you broke it. And the line here is that this displeased Samuel. There's Samuel. This is the actual moment, caught on film, when the people came to Samuel and says, we want a king. I got to show the internet folks on it. There you go. That's the moment where Samuel is displeased. Okay. Do you know how many times I laughed over this slide at home? It was so good. So there, Samuel is absolutely displeased. The word there is to be like broken. You broke it. When, like, have you ever like dropped something and it was so valuable and then it shattered? My dogs knocked over a tea kettle that my mother-in-law gave to my wife. The dogs, like, for some reason, they like to freak out every time someone visits the house and they lose their minds. And they got up on this table to look out and knocked the tea kettle over. And there's a plant that was in the tea kettle. And so there's dirt everywhere. And like, I'm trying to sweep this up. And she was away, where Nolan was at swim, and I thought, I'm going to try and put this thing back together. Because this is, kind of an important piece. So I got out the super glue, and I'm gluing everything back together. But it just never fit right again. And I couldn't get the pieces back in. I put it together the wrong way. I put two big pieces together, and then the small ones didn't fit. And I'm like, oh, I needed to do the small ones first, and then put the big ones on later. So I couldn't, so we ended up having to trash the thing. It was broken. I was just like, you guys, you ruined it. That's what I told my dogs. And they were they understood every word I said. I sat them down. I said, look, you can't lose your minds when people come to the door. We're not going to die. They're just FedEx drivers. It's okay. I think that was a turning point for them, that sit down and talk. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see. But this moment here is so dramatic. When they choose, we want a king. We don't want God's leadership. We want a king. When they choose that moment, in the narrative, it's almost like a second golden calf moment. Now, if you remember the story of Moses, he goes up on like Mount Sinai and all. They just left Egypt. Like, they had this huge, huge victory. God did this big, dramatic Red Sea, like crashing over all the enemies kind of a thing. And Moses is up on the mountain. He's been up there for 40 days, like, being God's secretary, is like writing things down, like, okay, writing down the law, 613 of them, right, on these stone tablets. And he comes down with these stone tablets. And the people who were down on the mountain, they got tired of waiting for Moses. And they're just like, all right, we need to worship something, and we can't figure out that fire that's on the top of the mountain. Let's just make what we're used to. And they threw all their gold jewelry together, and they made this golden calf, and they're like, yeah, all right, let's bow down and worship the golden calf, because we need something. And God's up on the mountain. He's like, hey, Moses, you better get down there, because this is bad news. And like, before the law is even like given to them, like, here is the covenant between God and us. And he comes down and it's like, okay, you screwed up before I even got, like, before the ink's dry. Like, that's the kind of this big, huge moment. This moment here where they reject God and say, no, we'd rather have a king, is a moment just like it's like a second golden calf, where they've rejected God and God's ways and God's plans for them as a people, and it just doesn't work out. Walter Brueggemann said this: the story of Israel's rejection of God's kingship as seen in the demand for a human king serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of forsaking divine guidance and seeking power and control for ourselves. And so this moment, we're like, oh, you broke it. It's a rejection of the people are absolutely rejecting God. And the word there used for displeased means, like, the other day I went in the fridge. We bought like this, like breakfast sausage in the roll kind, and you cut it. They actually give you lines to cut. And I was like, oh, I really want sausage for breakfast. So I went in the fridge and I pulled out the last roll. And I'm like, it's a funny shape. It was like, normally they look, very cylindrical, and this one looked more like a football. And I thought, what is this? And I'm kind of like doing this, and it's like someone inflated it with air or something. So I checked the expiration date, and I'm like, no, that's good. Expiration date doesn't say like it's gone. And then I pierced that thing, and it like popped. And then, that thing stank. I tell you. I was like, oh, I was displeased. I'll tell you that. The word there for when Samuel hears this moment and he is displeased is the same word that we would use in that moment when you pull a bad roll of sausage out of the fridge and you get a whiff of it and you're like, oh, Lord have mercy on all of our souls right now, because that went in a Ziploc and then it went in the trash because it was bad. But God has to tell him, this is not a rejection of you as their judge and leader that's been appointed their whole lives. It's a rejection of me. One of my favorite Old Testament scholars, Abraham Joshua Heschel, said this: when we reject God's guidance and choose our own path, we forsake the very essence of our being, disconnecting ourselves from the divine source of wisdom and righteousness. That's what happened in this moment. They rejected God's whole plan. Not just, we don't want God as a king, we'd rather have someone else as a king. There's so much baggage that came with that rejection, because there's a certain way that God wanted them to be. And so they're not just rejecting God, they're rejecting God's plan, God's way, everything that God was and dreamed of when he dreamed up this people. He's like, no, we don't want any of that. And so it was so much more. And James Cone says this: when we reject God's dream of liberation for all people, we betray the very essence of our faith, turning our backs on the call to solidarity and compassion. Because the biggest thing in the Old Testament that's so important is this idea of God's justice, fairness, and equity for all people. And it was supposed to be exemplified in the people that God called out. It's like, okay, you guys model how to do this, and then we'll show everybody else of the world how this works. And so there was different things that they had to do, even like canceling all debts after 50 years. All debts were forgiven and canceled. All lands that were sold to pay for debts were given back to the original families. It was like a reset button on society every 50 years called the Jubilee that Israel never once practiced, not one time. And so it was like kind of like this: I want you guys to figure this out and then show it to all the other nations. But they can't figure it out. Like the story of the Judges is them not figuring it out over and over and over and over and over again. And finally, instead of embracing God's way of justice, they're just like, all right, instead of us doing this God's way and showing the nations how to do that, how about we just become like they are? And we'll have a king and we'll be like them. And this rejection of God is a rejection of justice. It's not just, oh, they want to go worship other gods and all that. It wasn't that at all. They didn't want God's justice in place. And that's seen in the next section where God is actually saying, okay, but you got to tell the people, like, if they really want a king, this is what it's going to look like, and spell it out for them. And what they wanted was, well, we want somebody to fight for us. We want someone who's on our side. We want someone who's going to punch the bad guys in the jaw and take it for them. It's like, we can root them on. That's what we want. We want somebody who's on our side and who's going to fight for us. That's what they said. And Samuel's like, okay, but what's going to happen in this moment is, he's going to make you all his slaves. Like, that's just how it's going to go. That's what kings do, is they need people to serve them. So I think there's this huge long list of everything that the king is going to take from the people. He's going to take your sons for his army. He's going to take your women for his household. And he's going to take his crops for his kitchen. That's just how it's going to go. Tell the people that. And why in the world? Why would you say yes to that? That's what I wanted to know when I was reading this. Like, God spells it out for them. I'll give you a solemn warning. They're going to make everybody his slaves. He's going to steal all your stuff. And why did they say yes then? Why did they look at that and be like, yeah, that's a good deal. We will pay the price that you are telling us is how much it's going to cost? Yeah, sign me up. I didn't understand it. I was trying to figure it out. Abraham Joshua Heschel, again, he kind of gave me some clues. He said the desire of the Israelites to have a king like other nations reflects a lack of faith in God's ability to protect and guide them. It is a rejection of their unique identity as a chosen people. This is a rejection of, like, God has a whole special, unique identity for them. And then it goes on, and it's like, if you read the stories of like 1 Kings, it's pretty much just a big I told you so The story of 1 Kings and 2 Kings is pretty much like people being like, I told you this was going to happen. Like if you look at when Solomon, David's son Solomon, kind of the best known king of Israel at the time, when he became king, it says this in 1 Kings 9. This is the account of the forced labor that King Solomon conscripted to build his house. Okay, it's like we arrived here, guys. Everything that Samuel warned you about in chapter 8 here is now happening in 1 Kings 9. And then, even better, Solomon's son, like Solomon dies, he passes the monarchy to his son, Rehoboam. And the advisors come to him. There's young advisors and old advisors. The old advisors are like, okay, so what kind of leader are you going to be? We know that your father was a really hard man. We kind of think that you should go easy on the people because your father was really hard on the people. And he's like, okay, I'll take that in consideration. He goes to the young advisors. What should I do? And they're like, bring the hammer. That's what he said. Like, just bring the hammer down on the people and say, you thought my father was tough. You should see me. I will quote you a direct thing from the Old Testament of this moment with a little bit of Old Testament editing because it's not fit for church. I know. It's like, he said, this is out of 1 Kings 12. He said to his advisors, what do you advise that we answer the people who have said to me, lighten the yoke that your father has put upon us? And the young advisor said to him, this is what you should tell the people. My little finger is thicker than my father's loins. Old Testament quote. Whereas my father laid up on you a heavy yoke, I will add to that yoke. My father disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. Holy smokes. And so he does, just like the people said, and it turns into a civil war, dividing the country in north and south, and then 350 years later, everybody is taken over. Solomon's use of forced labor, according to Terence Fretheim, to build the temple and his own grand projects serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of centralized power and exploitation, leading to the oppression of the people. But what did they want? They said this, we want someone to fight our battles. We want someone to go in and fight our battles. This is a direct slap in the face to God, that language. Do you know why? Because in countless times, in Deuteronomy 7, Leviticus 18, God says, I want to shape you to be like the other nations are not. I want you to be different than the other nations. And then it says in Exodus, in Joshua, Exodus 14, Deuteronomy 3, God says, I will fight your battles for you. All you have to do is be still. So this language right here is like, we want a king to fight our battles for us. We want a king to go out and go before us in battle. This is a huge rejection of God in this moment. And we want a king to go before us in our battles and fight our battles for us. Do you know what went before the people in battle before this moment? Was the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was what went before the people. And they're saying, we don't want the God to fight our battles, and we don't want the Ark of the Covenant to go before us. We want a human king to do all that for us. It's a slap in the face to what God has already said. This is what I want for you. This is how you should be. And so they pick the direct opposite of what they should be. So the narrative is trying to get us to see that with the language it chooses. And it says this, the demand for a king to fight their battles reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of God's role as the ultimate protector and deliverer of the Israelites. It represents a shift towards reliance on human strength rather than divine intervention. So they want a king as an image of God instead of being the image of God. That's what it boils down to. God says, you are the image of God. Each one of you bear the image of God. You are to take my image and go and live it out in the world. And they said, nah, we'd rather just the king go do that for us. And they end up elevating this king all the way to the place and taking place of God. And this is the big, huge turning point in their story, is when they choose a human king over God's leading. And not just over God leading them, but their responsibility to be image bearers of God in the world. And they say, no, we don't want that. We would actually rather just kind of project that onto this person out there, and then they do it for us. And that moment there is where everything turns. That moment there is where everything starts to crumble. and everything falls apart in the entire Old Testament story. And so our reflection questions for today, if it's true that Israel's demands for a king is a rejection of God, where do we reject God's leadership in exchange for human ones? Because God has given each one of us an authority. We are all image bearers of God. We are all priests in God's kingdom. This is not just like I have a job to be up here and do this stuff, but I'm not any more special than you are. I just have a little bit of training and knowledge behind me, but we're all called to do this work. We're all called to be image bearers. Where do we exchange God's leadership in exchange for human ones? How about this one? If it's true that a rejection of God is a rejection of justice, then who will be excluded from justice when we demand that king? That's an important question. Who's going to be left on the outside? Third one, if it's true that I'm responsible to bear the image of God into my context, then how am I doing this well? And where do I outsource that work to other people? Those are some questions that I think are important for us to think about. Psalm 138 is our benediction today, and it's retold by modern poet Malcolm Guite. And it's going to talk about Babylon. Babylon is this empire that's in the Bible all over the place. From the Old Testament all the way through to Revelation. It signifies this Eden versus empire struggle that the whole people are in. And so this poem captures that. It says this: great Babylon will fall. We will awake. One short sleep past, we wake eternally. And even now the poets rise and shake us up a little, awaken us to see the loveliness and wonder. Turn our eyes towards your temple and the mystery which lives within us and will also rise and dawn upon the world. The poets sing. They sing in their singing. Make us wise, though I am in the midst of troubles. Bring me through them with your mighty hand. Restore me and refresh my soul, that I may sing with all the poets. Those who came before and stand before you now, and those you call this very night to worship and adore. Psalm 138, retold by Malcolm Guite.